April 12th, 2021. Our first presentation this evening is the Independence Power and Light Winter Storm 2021 Fuel Cost Adjustment. Mr. City Manager.
Yes, Madam Mayor and members of the council, for those of you who don't recall, it was cold in February. As a result, our community had to go through quite an ordeal of rolling blackouts and shedding load, and now our community is starting to see some of the effects of that financially. We communicated with our citizens last week that on average they could expect to see a $9 to $10 increase in their bill for each of the next 6 months. So several council members had questions about that, thought it might be a good idea to talk in a little more detail about what exactly that meant and what that might look like. So Jim Nail, Director of Independence Power and Light, has prepared a presentation for the council based on some of those questions we received. And if there are additional questions, certainly don't have to answer all tonight. We can continue to discuss this and go where the council would like in the long run. So I will yield to Mr. Nail to answer the questions we do have, and we will proceed from there.
Mayor, council, good evening. Here's another installment of the Winter Storm report. Just as a little backdrop, Independence and utilities all across the Midwest were all caught up in the effects of that winter storm. Unprecedented costs were hit across a lot of municipalities and a lot of power companies. Some of that was due to natural gas price increases that went up more than 100 times what they were the week before the storm. Energy prices as a result of that also increased dramatically during the course of that week. Once we got the costs in and do the normal monthly process that we review, Independence did have higher than normal fuel costs, and using the formula and my discretion to spread that out rather than hit it all at once, we came up with a fuel cost adjustment to apply on the April bills of 3.9915 cents per kilowatt hour. That's the fuel adjustment cost portion of the utility bill. One of the questions we got was, well, why did IPL issue a $200 credit only to turn around and raise rates? The first answer to that is the fuel cost adjustment and the credit are completely unrelated. It's two separate issues. The bill credit was a council action that was done in response to the resiliency and cash balance policy that had based on the December numbers, had a projected cash balance surplus, and deciding what the appropriate uses of that surplus was, the decision was made to issue that credit. The fuel cost adjustment is a utility practice that is used for either crediting or recovering expenses due to changes in your fuel energy costs. The base rates that the utility charges are based on a projected fuel cost that's looked at market costs. When you set the rates, you look at what you expect to pay for fuel, and then your fuel cost adjustment allows you to either recover higher costs or even give back when the fuel costs are below your projection. It hasn't happened for a while, but because our base rates are based on when we had coal, but when we had coal, some of you may remember, there were some months where we did have a credit on the counts for the fuel cost adjustment, because we might have gotten a good deal on a delivery of coal, so it brought our costs down, and we would do a credit on the bills. In this case, fuel costs were much higher than what the rates are based, so the fuel cost adjustment is the method for recovering that cost. And it's not a new thing that Power and Light has created. It's been part of our rate structure since the 1970s. And it's not a rate increase. It's a cost recovery tool that's part of the bill or the rate schedules. Just as an example, it's Schedule FA1, which is part of our published rate package. You can find this on the city website under the utility rates. And it goes into a lot of detail there about what the fuel cost adjustment is, how it's calculated. And that's there, like I said, it's Schedule FA1. Next question we got was, well, if there were profits generated Why were the increased fuel adjustment? What were the increased fuel costs that were passed on to the ratepayers? Well, first of all, there wasn't a profit, and there wasn't a profit reported. In fact, the slide that was shown to you at the last presentation showed that we had a net cost. Even though our units performed well and our contracts did help provide energy to Southwest Power Pool, which we got credit for, we still had a net cost. And as that was reported last month, that was only the SPP portion of those costs. That 1.8 million did not yet include our regular invoices that we pay to Nebraska City, to Iatan, to Dogwood, the wind farms. And in fact, we knew that there were going to be additional costs. We just didn't have them at the time that this slide was printed. Since then, fuel and expenses for IPL and Dogwood came in at around $7 million. $5 million of that was the natural gas bill at Dogwood. $5 million was our share of Dogwood's gas costs. And then $2 million for the fuel oil that we burned. All of our other contracts together were about $5 million. We put in here a comparison to February of last year so you can see the difference, the impact that polar storm had. Our typical bill for IPL and Dogwood was a tenth of what we saw last month or in February. The other resources actually didn't change near as dramatically as what ours, and that's primarily driven by the natural gas costs at Dogwood. But you can see that going from 2020 to 21, there was quite a large increase in the costs that we had to cover. Let's back up. And so as a result, putting all that together, we ended up with using a fuel cost adjustment to the ratepayer bills, 3.99 cents per kilowatt hour. If someone has, and in February, April timeframe, our customers, an average bill is about 600 kilowatt hours. So that's where that $9 to $10 example came from. Normally our fuel cost adjustment has averaged about 2.5 cents. It goes up and down a couple tenths of a %, but it's been averaged over the last year about 2.5. So 3.99 is about 1.5 cents higher. 1.5 cents times 600 megawatt or kilowatt hours is your $9 that customer would see as an increase to their bill. The third question that we had was again, can we give the example of what is the difference between modern efficient units and our older, less efficient ones? These numbers come from the EIA annual report, which shows the different types of generation. The numbers here, the heat rate is how much heat does it take for that piece of generation to generate X amount of power. So in this case, internal combustion, which would be your reciprocating engines, that's 8,295 BTUs per kilowatt hour. Compare that to the LM6000, which is the aeroderivative gas turbine, 9,000. Our CTs have a design rate, a nominal rate of 15,000. Now, one of the questions specifically what Councilman Steinmeier was asking was, what's the effect of that startup cost? And you can see here, our actual heat rate that we experience with our units jumps all the way up to 25,978 because of the fact that quite often we run for only a couple of hours and we run at low power. So you have fewer megawatt hours of energy to disperse those startup costs. Anytime you start up a unit, you have to burn a certain amount of fuel before it ever generates a single bit of power to the grid. So after you start generating, you have to cover the cost of that startup fuel. The shorter your run times, the lower the level that you run, the more it hurts you. And in this case, you can see that on our units, 25,978 BTUs compared to one of these newer units that's at the 8,000 and 9,000 level. So quite a difference. We took an average $2.50 per unit of natural gas and used that to put that into dollars. So you can see that these new units are a third of the cost of running ours.
Jim, so on the, on that right there on the 63 on the actual versus the nominal, so during this period of time for these 3 or 4 days, is that the actual one, or are we going on the nominal one for the time spent, or do we know what that number is?
Well, we would have been closer to that nominal number because we ran for a long period. We ran almost continuously for 5 days. All five of the units that were operating ran continuously. They did have some periods that they were running at low power, but they were able to run for a long period. What's going to affect the numbers, they wouldn't hit these numbers here just because we paid double the cost of the fuel oil to get it delivered. So that's going to spike the prices up a little bit in that case.
Okay, thank you.
Subject to your questions, that's it for this round.
Mr. Nail, you mentioned that you've calculated the cost for the fuel increase, the adjusted, and that'll be on our April bill?
A portion. As you saw from that slide, in a normal winter month, we might have $2 to $3 million of cost. This time we had 11, almost 12 million. That additional cost, we could run the formula and put that whole entire amount in as what we need to recover, but during this time, that would not be the right way to go. So what I used my discretion as director to take that 11 million or the about 8 to 9 million extra cost and to spread that out over several months so that it hits the ratepayers just a little bit a month instead of, I mean, some of our neighbors out in Oklahoma, Texas, they got hit with bills of $1,000, $2,000. One in the news even had a $6,000 bill his utility sent him. That's not right.
Yeah, there was one from Dallas that was like 14 or 17,000 or something. So, is there any dollars you can put that into what a regular, if my bill's $200 a month, $250 a month, is there, not pinning you down because you can't say exactly, but is it going to be $50 on the bill, you think, or 100, or do you know, is there a way you can guess at that?
Well, like I said, the average customer bill is around 600 kilowatt hours.
Okay.
So you're just under 4 cents. That'd be what, 4 cents times 600 kilowatts would be $24. So the fuel adjustment charge is listed separately on the bill.
Okay, good.
So it would be about 24. Normally,
Okay.
it's been down in the range of 15. So it's about an extra $9 added on to the bill to what they've been seeing here in recent months.
Well, that's great news, in my opinion. So, good deal. And
Jim?
that's all the questions.
Sorry. Jim,
Yes, sir.
so I'm gonna come at this at a little different approach, okay? So February 15th, 5 a.m., SPP declared a level 1 energy emergency, right? So that was their first alert. And then it escalated quickly to a level 2, level 3. So these were emergency alerts telling us that the conditions had changed dramatically, and there was they were having problems supplying energy to the 546,000 miles that they covered in 14 states. So, would you agree that was an emergency at that point?
Oh, absolutely.
And now FEMA's involved down there, because it's been declared an emergency down there?
Well, they certainly did. FEMA declared emergency in Texas. I don't know that they declared
in
an
Texas
emergency.
they have, I know, because my father-in-law's lost his house, and we're working with FEMA to try to figure things out down there. So they had that emergency position. I'm going to come at you in a different way. I think it was an emergency, and you think it was an emergency. We acted upon the emergency. I'm just curious, how much is in our emergency reserve fund?
Well, we have the reserve levels that were identified in the cash balance and resiliency policy was their target band recommended was 67 plus or minus 10%. So
Right.
62 million, I think, is the bottom of the band that PUAB and council decided to use.
Sure. So if we agree that this was an emergency situation, it was an act of God, right? And it created an emergency. And we have ratepayer money sitting in an emergency reserve fund. Shouldn't we be taking 11 million of that and applying it towards this?
That would be one possibility.
I think it'd be a
However,
good possibility.
the cash balance and resiliency policy set at the bottom threshold said below that bottom threshold, action needs to be taken to try to bring it back. We're already going to be below that bottom threshold.
I get it, but whose money is it?
The ratepayer, certainly.
Right, and so, so rather than having this perception that we've given 11 million, now we're gonna scrape it back with a few bucks a month. But we have in place a fund for such emergencies like this. I would think, unless I don't understand the definition of emergency, but I would think that this would be a good use of ratepayer money to offset this cost because it was an emergency. That's just my position. And I think it would be a good thing to use ratepayer money to offset this emergency, since that's kind of what it's designated for, unless I'm missing the definition of emergency.
Well, I understand your position, sir, but as director, I don't think it's good policy for me to recommend taking us another $11 million below the threshold that council set, which is what that would do.
Okay, so,
And the fuel cost adjustment is a mechanism that's already established for recovering those costs, and the fact that we can do it incrementally softens the blow.
okay, so then let's open up something else. Okay, so when I looked at some of this, my thing was, if we ran for 5 days, I wanted to do some more math in terms of the startup cost with high efficiency, low efficiency. You've kind of given us these. I'm not sure where this calculation's coming from. But if we had double cost of fuel oil, so the numbers are kind of skewed here, right? So we don't have actual numbers of the startups, and then for 5 days they ran at high efficiencies, how much would it cost us versus low efficiencies, and how much would we have saved? So in other words, if we would have had, a savings of $4 or $5 million in that period of time, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to think through the math.
Well, and certainly the numbers would have been better, because, I mean, you can see here that the design rate for those newer systems is a third
Right.
of what our experience is with our units. So you would have used a third of the fuel. So at $2 million worth of fuel that we burned, we only would have burned maybe a third to half of it instead of the $2 million that we did have
And that's for the 5 days?
for the 5 days.
That's
We had
quite-
$2 million of fuel delivered over that 5-day period.
Oh, okay, $2 million. Okay. So, let's talk about some of the risk factors here. Do we have anybody that kind of hedges the risk of the volatility of the market, or is the Oneta contract a policy that we bought to hedge risk?
No, sir. The Oneta policy was purchased because we have a requirement to supply 112% of our load as guaranteed capacity to Southwest Power Pool. When we retired Blue Valley 3, we dropped below that threshold, and so the Oneta contract was simply to get us back to our obligation with Southwest Power Pool for capacity.
So we asked for that and got it?
Yes.
Okay. So do we have anybody that understands how to hedge risk at IPL?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I mean, we have a risk analysis that was done and presented to the council and the PUAB as part of that cash balance policy.
Well, in the marketplace, when it comes to energy, Jim, there's the volatility and there's the risk. And you have lots of companies that hedge risk in these types of volatile markets. I'm just curious if there's anybody that kind of has put a plan together to kind of hedge that risk. Do we have anybody that does that at IPL?
Our rates and planning group, they do look at what the forecasts are, and Tenaska is our partner in how we market power.
Yeah.
One of the things that we do is we watch the fuel costs, and if fuel costs are dropping,
Right.
we will buy a load to add to our tanks so that we have the supply that we have is at a lower cost.
Okay.
That's one of the few things that we control is the fuel that we have on hand.
So within our buying agreements, we talked about this early on, this back when we had this big spike in this cold snap. Was there a force majeure called at all? Did we talk to the legal people here in the city to see if that was an option for us?
We did not declare a force majeure. The gas companies declared force majeure against both Onetta, down at Onetta, and they lost their gas supply for, I think, a day or two.
Yeah, but we have purchase agreements for a certain cost, correct?
We have our purchase agreements are with Nebraska City, Omaha Public Power District, and Evergy for the Iatan plant. And we're contracted at a certain dollar amount per megawatt hour delivered. Plus, we also, as part of that contract, we cover a portion of their operating costs, and which would include their fuel adjustment cost and their debt service.
Okay, so in your mind, everything went as it's supposed to legally?
Everything went as designed, yes, sir.
And we've not checked with council to make sure that that is in fact the case?
IPL staff have looked at the contracts, but we have not asked city legal to review that, no, sir.
Okay, because, I mean, I know it was a bad situation, but I just want to make sure that we understand that, a lot of things went wrong. And there were a lot of companies that are now bankrupt. A lot of people lost their jobs, CFOs, CEOs. And I'm questioning whether we should have had legal look at our agreements and make sure that if there was any way to recapture some of the costs involved in this, that we should have done that.
Well, the costs with Nebraska City and with Iatan and the wind farms were not dramatically different than our regular costs. The only reason that Dogwood's costs went up dramatically was the gas price. And so we paid our 12.5% share of that gas cost as owners of the plant.
Okay, well, I just wanted to make sure that whatever we're doing to protect the ratepayers, that we've looked at every avenue.
I understand.
And I really think we ought to consider this an emergency and looking for ways to absorb that with the ratepayers' money that we're holding right now. I think that would be the right thing to do.
So, Mr. Nail, just so I'm clear, in our agreements with Iatan, Nebraska City, Dogwood, so on and so forth, those agreements do not include a guaranteed price for the fuel?
Correct.
Okay.
They have a fuel adjustment charge
Yeah.
Built into their, just like we do for ours.
That was my question is, which I just wanted to be clear from Councilman Steinmeier's questions, that we're subject to the volatility of the price of that component of the cost to buy the energy. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, Councilman Huff?
Yeah, Jim, I have a few questions, but these probably won't be able to answer tonight. I don't know if we can get somebody to give them back to you. But we was talking about on the load here. What was the peak load daily on this for them 3 or 4 days?
I'll have to get back to you on that. I
Okay,
don't
that's
know
fine.
what it was.
Yeah, because I don't want to take a bunch of time.
Now, do you mean
So our
do you
price
mean the
agreements-
system load or IPL's load?
Our price agreements, we've got about 80 megs that I figured, so, because I think Nebraska was running at like 60% or something like that at the time. They was having a few issues up there. So we had 80, and I was just wondering where we bought the rest of that energy. That's one of them.
Well, we bought all of our energy from Southwest Power Pool.
Yeah, okay. So I would like to see what the difference between the peak and that. But my biggest concern here is the dogwood one. And I've done a little research on it also. They were operating 4 days before over the Valentine's Day and everything. And on the day of the crisis here, they was held up, basically ransom for $100 million to keep operating. So they shut down for 3 days. They come back up online and they were paying about the same price as a regular month. So they was down for the 3 days in the crisis. They only operated 4 days out of range there, where it was a little bit higher, but it wasn't like the 100 times. So I was just wondering if we can get someone to make sure we're getting dealed the right numbers there too. It just seems like a lot of money to me for when they was down, they wasn't even operating.
I believe they shut down on the 17th.
Yeah, it's 3
Late,
days.
late on the 16th or early on the 17th was when they pulled the plug. So that it was just, they just were incurring more costs than they could cover. And then they came back the 19th or 20th.
And on the figures, how did we arrive at this 11 million? Is this totally just what's sent to you, or, because I noticed you were saying on the oil, we didn't really have a number, not to nickel dime, and you can answer these later, I'm not worried about it
Well,
tonight.
the 11 million is the total of the invoices that we received from OPPD, Evergy, the wind farms, Dogwood. As those invoices all come in, our rates and planning group work all those together to find out, to see what the overall cost for that period, billing period is.
Sure, and I'm assuming that our staff figured these numbers and put this together?
Yes.
Okay, all right. The only other thing I have that I'd like to, later on, is I'd like to know what steps that we're going to take to mitigate this in the future if it happens again. I've talked to a few people about it, not quarterback, and I don't know the answer either. I'm just wondering, I know that you went after the old policy that was put in a long time ago and followed that thing, and maybe that's not the right one, or maybe it is. I'm not one to say. I just trying to make sure that we're covering this in the future, because I'm sure we're going to have some more events down the road as things change. But
I'm not sure which policy you're referring to. You're talking about our emergency plan? Our
yeah,
emergency
shed
operating
load,
plan?
and yeah.
Well, one of the things that we are looking at, we have found there is a software program that's designed to work with our outage management system, where we wouldn't be able to send out an advance notice that they're about to lose their power, but we would be able to, with a click of the mouse, we'd be able to select that group of customers affected by outage and send them a text message that says, we know this is an outage, this is a roll, we can script it to say, this is a temporary outage, you don't have to call us, we already know about it. And we could send out additional alerts as we know when things are coming back on. And that'll work directly with our outage management system to keep the citizens informed.
Right. And the last thing I have on this, you were saying the average bill would go up $9 to $10 increase a month. And what I read was 6 months and be reviewed at that. But when I look at this, that's about the same amount that we give back, which was $193 to everybody. So my calculation, 6 months is $60. I think we're going to come up a little short. Same amount of money, same amount of customers. So I just want to be straight with the customers here. If it's going to be longer, let's just say it's going to be longer, or whatever road you choose. We need to be very transparent in that. So in 7 months, they don't continue to have this $10 tag, or for 2 years or whatever. So,
Right. From month to month, we'll continue to evaluate this each month, and we'll let everyone know what's going on.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead, Karen.
I know that I got text saying we're gonna be experiencing an outage of, in this neighborhood, and we'll let you know, we're trying to keep it under 20 minutes. And so I was able to get on next door and let the neighborhood know. And if we can purchase a program that would do that citywide, that would be exceptional. But in the meantime, please extend my thanks and many citizens' thanks to the hard work of the IPL staff.
Thank you. I do want to say our production and maintenance staff were at those substations almost around the clock, even in the worst of that weather. And our transmission and distribution crews, some people said, well, my power was out for an hour. Well, at the same time this was going on, we had the normal
Regular outages.
car ran into a pole or somebody, you know, and so our transmission and distribution crews were also out in the middle of this storm taking care of business. The IPL crews deserve a hand.
Okay. Were there other questions or comments? Yes, Councilman Perkins?
Thank you, Mayor. To follow along with Councilman DeLucy's comments too, with the information that was coming out, rolling out, I too was able to get it out to some of the community leaders and stuff like that, and also beginning to work with Meg to see how we can get this type of information into our Hispanic community there in their Latino language, so they can be more fully informed, so when this takes place, they're not wondering what the heck happened. It's a really good communication point for us to work on that, so that some good stuff came out of it. Thank you for everything you guys have done. One question, so in theory, if we had all of our equipment modern, up to date, ready to fire in a hot minute, are we not still subject to the SPP regulations if they say we need you to slow down, speed up, turn on, turn off? Are we still fluctuating with what they ask us to do?
Yes, Councilman, the SPP controls the generation, and then they also issue the rolling blackout. The load shedding is the term. They issue the load shedding instructions, and they do distribute that across the whole region.
And that's part of the contract being with them.
That's part of being
with the pool.
that's part of being on the team.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Neal, I do have one more question, I'm sorry, or maybe two. I don't recall at the time, Texas is not in the SPP, so let's take them out of the equation. Did anybody in that region, any state declare a state of emergency? I don't recall that anybody declared a state of emergency.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Just Texas, I think.
That was my recollection as well. I mean, to Councilman Steinmeier's point, if they had, this would be a totally different ballgame. I mean, if there was a state of emergency declared because of this situation, then we'd be talking about FEMA and money and, you know, ways to recover this cost. It was a dangerous situation for sure. I mean, but we came out of it with fairly minor inconvenience for most people. So that's great, and that's part of being part of the team. But now we got to pay the bill, and I just think that we're trying to understand how to do that. And what have we learned from this situation about there may be no way to avoid it in the future, but it's just, you know, a fascinating sort of scenario to look at and say, what could we have done differently, or what could SPP have done differently? I mean, there's just a lot of questions, and it's certainly not to be critical of anything that you and your staff and our city did. I was one of those people who had a regular old power outage in the middle of this power outage, and I say all the time, when a guy's climbing a pole in your backyard in the dark and the freezing cold, you don't care what your bill is. You just want your power back on. So our, you know, great appreciation to those folks who make sure that our power does stay on. But I think these are important conversations to have, and they're educational for all of us. Somebody makes a policy decision somewhere along this chain of this, you know, big group of what to turn off, when to turn it off, who's gonna charge what for the product coming in to make this all happen. So, you know, I appreciate your patience with us and understanding a very complex issue. And
Certainly.
there'll be more, I'm sure, to come.
We'll be ready to answer anytime.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, next, Mr. City Manager, WPC Fund Resiliency and Cash Balance Policy.
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, in accordance with our strategic plan, Independence for All, staff has presented to the council and has been adopted by the council cash resiliency policies for both Independence Power and Light and the water utility. This evening, we are pleased to present to you for our third and final utility, water pollution control, the proposed cash resilience policy. Once again, that will be presented by Chris Lover from our utility financial advisor, PFM. Chris is joining us virtually, and I will go ahead and yield to him to provide this presentation.
Well, good afternoon or good evening. It's Chris Lover of Public Financial Management. Do I need to share my screen?
If you could, that would be good. I don't know if everybody has it in front of them. Oh. Okay, thank you.
And if I may ask, are folks looking at the cover slide, Resiliency and Cash Balance Study of Independence Water Pollution Control Department?
Yes, Chris.
Okay, thank you. I just had a couple of different versions across the three different departments open. Just wanted to make sure we're talking about the right department. As the city manager detailed, this is the third study PFM has completed and it's presented. And it deals with some of the circumstances that Mr. Nail just talked about with some of these uncertainties and risks. And ideally, we can identify these risk levels, the amount of cash to put aside against these risks so that we can have some price stability for our ratepayers and help the utility manage kind of the rough times. Now, a few differences that the study has with let's talk about the similarities. A lot of this study follows the same kind of analytical analysis, so it should look fairly familiar to the city council. And we'll walk through how we get to a recommended cash balance level. A lot of this is driven by history, meaning we reviewed all the operational and financial performance of the Water Pollution Control Department, and a lot of the variability that we see in the revenues and expenses are used to drive the scenarios, ultimately add up to the recommended level. One thing that is different is that we meaning PFM recommended a level for the PUAB exceeding $16 million, and then the PUAB felt that was a little high and elected to, their recommendation was to just reduce that to a flat $10 million. So that's the one thing that's different. And this presentation will walk through our analysis and then have some slides to show you where the PUAB comments are. I'll go through a couple of these slides relatively quickly. The purpose, I think, basically price stability for one, and ability to address some of the risks that arise operationally and financially. We follow a methodology looking at four big areas, which you'll see in the middle of this slide. Revenues won't materialize, expenses that come in higher than forecast. We look at working capital, which is kind of the number of days of cash you need to generally manage the utility based on the days involved in the billing cycle, and also some capital reserve to ensure reliability of the system. In terms of cash balances, one thing we do note, the Water Pollution Control Department is a little bit different than the other two utility systems, meaning their debt service reserve fund, which is highlighted in yellow. This is legally required. It's a covenant that the city has made to bondholders That means that a lot of the cash is unavailable, it has to sit in this reserve for no other use. So when you see that yellow highlight at the bottom, even though the Water Pollution Control Department had about $30 million, about 70% of it really isn't available. You look at the debt service reserve fund and the bond construction funds of CIP projects that have been approved and not completed. So that's a pretty high number. For IPL, that was 20%, and then for the water department, it was about 35%. So you can see a different type of cash balance availability factor here. This slide summarizes our findings. Basically, the current cash available on hand is about $9.6 million. And under the recommended level, the part that's has a double strike through it, that was what the PFM analysis indicated would be a prudent level. That was $16.5 million. And then the PUAB's level of $10 million is the blue part. So now you can see the math step here of where you're below target, but under the PFM recommendation, it was close to $7 million below. And with the PUAB recommendation, you're basically in that bandwidth of plus or minus 10%. So a few things, COVID is one thing that permeates these three studies, and the uncertainty of it in many instances that has pointed us into a risk area. We say, let's reserve more cash against some of these risks. I think that Independence is a pretty stable area that says cash balances can be lower as you weather some of these economic storms and things like that, or extreme weather storms. And then there are some challenges to your demographics also. Say it's a higher cash balance. So what we try to do is strike a prudent balance between reserving a lot and reserving a little, and trying to look at each individual risk at its own level, and then also in the aggregate. Some observations and trends. You're an essential service provider with the WPC. It's one of the most highly regulated industries. There is a lot of political type issues involved with this, actually more so than we see in the electric departments. So a lot of regulatory risk and political risk. You actually promote your customers not using your product as much through things like low flow toilets. So conservation is very important to people. So you have basically one of the industries where you're you're trying to have people not use your product as much, which is not exactly a capitalist behavior. And finally, weather can impact water pollution control. You have wet weather, like wet seasons. You have water intrusion into your pipes. You have more treatment facility, and that means greater flows and a greater cost generated. So it does have some weather impacts here. In terms of our risk analysis, the first thing we tried to do is look through essentially all the expenses, operating expenses of the Water Pollution Control Department, and then through some mathematical analysis as well as discussions with the general manager and our staff, try to figure out what percentage of these are fixed on a year-to-year basis and what are truly variable. And what we generally concluded was that about 85% of all the expenses are fixed. Even though you might say, I'm not going to spend those dollars on treatment, they don't have the flow or the chemicals, reality is that there's a constant level of fixed expenses. When you include the payment in lieu of taxes, debt service, and acquired debt service coverage, that's about $9 million to the overall expenses. So what we say here is that there's a fixed cost base for the utility of about $24 million that generally needs to be addressed every single year, even when you have fluctuations in revenue. And this is a similar number as we saw with the water department. So this is one of our risk areas, and again, it's mathematically driven. And I'll walk through the table at the top. And basically, there's a number we saw previously that we have all these fixed costs at the Water Pollution Control Department, total about $24 million. On that most conservative level, we've assumed a variance of 7%, which has been some of the largest changes that the utility has seen on a year-to-year basis. We've also said well, maybe we go down to 3%. That was something they saw in another year, meaning a change and a reduction in overall flows. And then if we do the math step, back to 24 million times 7%, and that's for the year, you get the $1.7 million when you multiply all those factors together. So on this revenue risk, basically we're saying sales decrease because there's an economic recession, that people aren't working, they're not using the service as much. And we felt that with the COVID environment, this was a bigger risk to the Water Pollution Control Department, and we said we should go to the most conservative level. So this is the big macroeconomic risk for, call it the state, the region, the country. Our next one is loss of a top customer, and this is a similar methodology, but this looks at some of the bigger customers of the utility, for example, Lipton, Unilever, some of the other folks that are listed as the top customers year to year for WPC. And basically this can represent the microeconomic risk or the idiosyncratic risk of a business either going out of business or maybe changing their product line, which we did see with Unilever a few years ago. And here it's the same math step. We're saying you got to cover a fixed cost base. It is a large customer in this instance that's responsible for about 3.1% of revenue. You lose them or they change their product line, you can't immediately address that into the rate structure. So we said on a most conservative basis, let's go to the more conservative level and say we need $0.8 million for this. So again, this is the microeconomic risk. It can represent the loss of a top customer, a change in the business or the product of that top customer. Can also reflect conservation efforts too, and some of the low flow toilets and the things that we're seeing across the United States. And these two risk areas are something we use for both the IPL and the water department. Similar methodology. Interest income is the third area of revenue risk. And the idea here is that given an interest rate environment where rates have fallen from what you projected, you did expect some revenue to come in, and now it's not going to materialize. What does this risk represent? How much should we set aside for it? So this was, again, $30 million is generally the amount of cash that's held in the system. We're saying that interest rates have fallen about 100 basis points. So as the finance staff goes to reinvest those funds, they're not going to get 1% out of it. They might get 0.1%. So in this instance, we said $0.3 million was appropriate for this level, and those are our three revenue risks. On the expense side, this is a rather busy slide here, but what we wanted to do is look at the composition of four major expense areas: collection, lab services, treatment, disposal, then your A&G expense. And these percentages, the first group you see are what percentage of the overall operating expense are they. So treatment and disposal is your largest expense. And if you look down here, there's been, in that second part of the table, this is the growth or change year to year in that expense. So as you can see, treatment disposal, virtually every year we looked at except for 2019, you've had some escalating costs above the rate of inflation. So when we start thinking about expense risk, we first looked at transmission and distribution, then we'll look at the others. So on our next slide, again, the treatment disposal roughly equates to about $10 million a year. And some of the variances we looked at were what we observed across those 10 or 15 years on the previous slide. So we did the math here, said for the recommended level right in the middle, the moderate level, 10 million, 3% variance for 1 year, and that gets to $300,000 for this risk area. Those costs have been relatively consistent, but again, the biggest component of the operating expenses for WPC. For our other expense risk, this is relatively minor. We just said let's go with a less conservative level. So we didn't think it was really that big of a deal compared to treatment disposal. Working capital, this is one of the biggest areas for our recommendation. When we talk about a billing cycle, so from a ratepayer flushing their toilet, that's treated on day one of the first month. They get the bill at the end of that month. they typically have another 30 days to pay. So when you do that math step there, you get about 60 days from the use of the service and incurring of the expenses, the actual cash collection. So when we look at the recommended level of days cash, we generally say 30 is too short, 60 is kind of sweating it out a little bit, and we generally recommend 90 days of operating expenses here. And that's really just due to the billing cycle that we see across utilities. The last area of risk is capital reserve. And basically we have capital projects for the resiliency of the system. Again, this could address some of the regulatory risk of this type of utility. And here we said, let's look at the average CIP and take about $6 million and say that's how much you have to get these projects going and operating and kind of prime the pump on those, so to speak. So here's our summary, PFM recommendation. So the items in green are the recommended levels across risk areas. As you can see, we didn't just say, let's just take the most conservative. Let's just prudently look at these and figure out what really the true risk is to WPC. When you add up all the green boxes, again, the biggest mover is working capital, followed by the capital reserve. That gets you a value of about $16.5 million. Then we build a bandwidth around it, plus or minus 10%. And you can see that lower box there is about $14.9 million to $18.2 million. Now, on our next slide, essentially, we put the PUAB recommendation in here. So on the lower part of the chart, we have $10 million as a recommended level, and then the bandwidth of $9 to $11 million. But there really wasn't any risk area assigned to it. Meaning, how did you get to 10 million? And, basically, that was the motion by the PUAB. And then PFM, after the fact, went through and said, well, if we had to explain this to a rating agency, because we have these two other methodologies across these two other utility systems, how would we say we bin this? And we basically came up with some back-of-the-envelope math saying, well, this is what it really represents. Kind of on the least conservative path for risks, for your revenue risk and your expense risk, middle of the road for working capital, and then again, less conservative levels for construction and capital reserve. And that gets you to 10.6 million if you took that methodology, which is really trying to figure out how we can explain this to someone. But again, PUAB's recommendation was flat $10 million. For the cash available, we down here under the target, we walked the dog on what's funds available. It's 9.6 million, a target of $10 million from PUAB, and basically you come out to being within your bandwidth here, towards the lower end, but you're within the bandwidth. What we then did is compared this proposed level to kind of what the peers in and around the region do. And we pick these peers, A, because they're kind of near you, and number two, they generally support the populations of cities similar in size to Independence. And this is, some of these systems are hard to define. You have to read through some annual financial reports to figure out if it's water or wastewater or sanitary sewer or the combined utilities, and it can be difficult to strip them out. But for the most part, I think the telling thing here is that PFM recommendation, that yellow line, gets you to about 300 days cash. Going to the $10 million level gets you to about 180. And then when you look at these peer utilities that are doing water and water pollution control, sewer and sanitation, that really puts you at the low end of the stack. Is it survivable? Yes, but it's just different. You can see the lowest one we have in this list is Lawton, Oklahoma, at about 200 days. On our, basically our recommended level here, we've adjusted this slide so the bandwidth is $9 to $11 million and a target of 10 million in general. And I think the rating agencies would look at this and say, well, it's nice you have a policy. What does it represent? And I think you kind of fall back and just say, well, it's a flat $10 million, and I'm not exactly sure what it represents. But we could always craft a more creative message than that. But I think the nice thing about the prior methodologies that we did with IPL, we did with the water department, is that we can say we really looked at the operational and financial risk of those utilities, and this one's kind of a different story if we go to the PUAB recommendation here. And I think this just highlights water pollution control will be looking at a refunding transaction. So that's why we did bring up some of the ratings discussion, and how having that target a little bit below all your peers might cause some questions from the rating agency. But I think that kind of concludes the prepared comments from PFM. And if there are any questions or any further detail folks would like to know about them, I'd be glad to answer.
I did have one question on page 23, the comparable regional wastewater sewer utilities page of cash balance, right there. What I always am interested in looking at is the S&P rating, and whether we do 300 days or 181 days, it remains an A. Is that, how do we know that? That seems like,
Well, I put the current rating on there.
okay,
So basically what we're looking at is that moving from the 300 level to 180-ish basically says that, you might be going into another bin, and they look at three big financial metrics. One of them is base cash, one of them is debt service coverage, one of them would be fixed charge coverage. So you'd slide into a different bin, so they'd look holistically at a couple other metrics. And, I would say that the 180 days is not fantastic, especially if you look here at peer utilities. But, it's not 60 days, which for some low-rated A utilities we'll see folks are at 60 to 90 to 100 days.
okay, thank you. Are there other comments or questions? Okay. Sorry, let me get back up to where we were. So I think we're at next steps. Mr. City Manager?
Yes, Madam Mayor, members of the council, as with the two preceding utility cash resiliency policies, staff would bring forward the recommended policy in the form of legislation for the council to vote upon at an upcoming meeting.
Do you know when that will be? Do we have that scheduled on the calendar?
The 19th, coming up in
Okay,
a week
on
from
the
today.
19th, okay. Sometimes these things sneak up on us and they're pretty complicated, so I want to make sure we have ample time for the public and the council to look at this. Will this be in just the form of a resolution or non-ordinance action item, or is this going to be coming as an ordinance?
It'll be the form of a resolution.
Resolution, okay,
Correct.
yes. Councilman Huff?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed something here. This third back in this presentation, it says PFM reviewed the refunding opportunities for IPL's outstanding 2012 B sewer system revenue bond. I'm lost. Why is IPL involved in that?
I'm being told that's a Scribner's error. Council member shouldn't
Okay.
refer to IPL. Yeah.
I was like, what's this?
Yep. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I don't think IPL does the sewer bonds, but unless something's changed.
That's all right.
Okay.
Madam Mayor.
Okay, yes. Councilman Hobart?
I wanted to ask Mr. Walker, or maybe Mr. Kidney, do we know how much the refunding this November will get out of that? Any idea at all yet?
Yeah, I think Chris Lover on the line could answer that for us. Chris, if you're prepared.
Sorry about that. My dog is wanting to go outside, but it is about 20% savings. And the one thing about that is that savings goes out basically every year to 2041, which is the final maturity. On a dollar basis, I think I I could probably just send a note on what it is, but I know it's about 20%.
20% of the amount outstanding?
Of the debt service, of the current debt service. You'd say
Okay.
about 20% of your current debt service.
Okay, I got you. And then, more directed to not the folks on the call, but Mr. Walker's office. And I'm guessing Mr. Norris was at the PUAB meeting. Was there any other, rationale given for the $10 million number?
I can ask Mr. Norris to summarize that for the council.
I don't recall any real rationale or basis for it. It was, they looked at the different risk levels, and that was kind of a number that they arrived at after some discussion among the members.
Well, that's all I had for you.
So,
Hey, Adam.
yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna, I always ask this question, how many times have we ever dipped into the reserves for WPC? Or have we ever?
I can't answer that question. I'm not sure. Probably very rarely, if we ever have.
That's all.
So, Mr. City Manager, is the recommendation that is coming to the council, we have two conflicting recommendations here. We have the recommendation from PFM and we have the recommendation from the PUAB. So, can you tell us what, or how is that going to come before the council?
Our intent would be to bring it forward with the endorsement that came from the Public Utility Advisory Board.
Okay, thank you. I think we found an answer.
Sorry, clarify this. During emergency circumstances, we have gone over budget, and we've had to dip into reserves to cover those emergencies.
Okay. Okay, any other comments or questions? Okay, thank you very much. Our next item is the presentation of the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Mr. City Manager.
Okay, good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the council. Again, I'm Zach Walker, City Manager, and I'll be giving this presentation to you this evening. Tonight I'm going to just give you a quick summary of what the American Recovery Plan is and also what it is not. I'll give you a quick summary of the staff recommendation of how to allocate these dollars. And then this past Friday, staff presented this at a meeting of the Audit and Finance Committee. So I'll give you a quick summary of the committee's dialogue about that preceding the meeting this evening. The American Recovery Plan is yet another federal bill adopted by the United States Congress in response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. This plan specifically provided $350 billion with a B dollars in emergency funding for state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. 130 billion of that 350 billion was allocated directly for local governments. A key difference between this legislation and the CARES Act, these dollars are flowing directly to cities. You may recall with the CARES Act, it was proportioned out to counties and states, and then counties and states work different methodologies about allocating it to communities. In this instance, direct funding is coming to the City of Independence. Our portion is $20.3 million. So the presentation that I'll give you this evening, ultimately council will have the responsibility for deciding how to allocate that, but the zero-sum game that you're working within is the $20.3 million. Some other key ways that this legislation differs from the Federal CARES Act of last year. You may recall with the CARES Act, those funds had to be utilized for unbudgeted, unplanned expenditures directly related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it could not be used for revenue replacement as a result of the economic impact of the pandemic. Conversely, with the American Recovery Plan, these dollars can be used both for revenue replacement and they can be used for some pretty broad outcomes so long as those are utilized with the intent of providing economic resilience, recovery, and stability within those local communities. A priority of that intent, though, of the legislation is that those items should not be those which will receive federal reimbursement. So for activities that we have been tracking our expenditures over the last year that are eligible for FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association reimbursement, we are discouraged from utilizing it for that. They want this to really target those items that won't be subject to reimbursement. So let me talk to you quickly. In each of your packets, you should have a summary of the staff proposal, and for those watching online, this is attached to the agenda item as well. Within the proposal that you see tonight, you'll see different headers. For example, the very first one we'll talk about is reducing blight in commercial corridors, entryways, and neighborhoods. Each of these items are reflective of the council priorities that were discussed last August at the council strategic planning session, that we received feedback from our community through our citizen survey about the strategic plan, and that were ultimately adopted in our annual business plan by the council last month. So we've really tried to be responsive to the council priorities as laid out in our recent discussions. I would say we are in a fortunate position that many of these items would otherwise not be funded. Our budget position simply would not allow for us to fund all of these items at the level that's being proposed to you tonight. So these are all one-time expenditures because this is one-time money. In matching your city financial policies, we are trying to avoid providing funding for things that would require ongoing financial support. So very quickly, I'll highlight these, and then afterwards, if the council has questions about any specific item, we'll try to provide more context as well. But within the realm of reducing blight in commercial corridors, entryways, and neighborhoods, city staff is recommending $285,000 be allocated for the abandoned vehicle enforcement program. Several years ago, the police department did have a parking enforcement officer on staff. When that position retired, budget constraints required us to eliminate that position. In the kind of the hierarchy of calls for service, abandoned vehicles sometimes fall towards the bottom. This would make that a targeted effort of some part-time help to match that community need. Illegal dumping mitigation, specifically purchasing cameras for some of our known illegal dumping hotspots, which would help us both deter the activity as well as prosecute those who would engage in illegal dumping activities. Right-of-way trash removal, $1 million being proposed for this. Again, focusing on those main corridors, hiring seasonal, part-time, or temporary help to come in and pick up trash and clean up the right-of-ways in those areas. And then the dangerous building program at $820,000. We estimate that this would allow funding for the demolition of 80 to 85 of our most dangerous and structurally unsound properties across the community. We're recommending $2.4 million for the Highway 24 enhancement project. This was a project that received federal grant funding. Unfortunately, it didn't fund the full scope of the project that the city has in mind. With the recent replacement of the bridge near the Truman Library, with the $20 to $30 million investment within the Truman Library, we believe that 24 is becoming more of a key gateway and corridor through our community, and so matching that other public and private investment that has occurred in that area, we think is a responsible thing to do, and that's why we're recommending the full project funding in this program. Improving public infrastructure and facilities, we're recommending just slightly over $2.1 million be allocated to pay off the debt that was loaned from the Parks Department to the from the Water Department to the Park Fund a few years ago for the construction of the Uptown Market, or others may know that as the Farmers Market. By paying off that outstanding debt, that will free up $177,000 annually for the Parks Department to allocate towards maintenance and operations within the Park Service. Stabilizing and revitalizing neighborhoods was another council priority. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about a housing study. We currently have a request for proposals out, seeking services, professional services for that. We're proposing $120,000 That's based on data that we've gotten from some of our peer cities who've recently completed similar studies. We're also suggesting just shy of $250,000 be allocated for sidewalk installation and replacement, specifically for better connectivity between some of our residential areas and our schools. At one time, there was significant grant funding for a Sidewalks to Schools program. Some of those grant dollars have gone away in recent years, and this would help bring back what was a very popular and successful program in our community. Reducing crime and disorder, we have 3 items here specifically to help bolster and buoy the efforts of our police department. A very popular topic of conversation, I know, among the council has been doing all things necessary to help fill our vacant positions within our police department. So we are suggesting $600,000 be set aside for a police hiring incentive program. This could be to help pay the cost of attending the police academy. It could be a recruitment or retention incentive. And then also, I would say a lesser priority, but certainly one that we could utilize these funds for, with the 30 new officers that would be funded by the use tax. That is intended to be used for hiring of personnel. So this could help acquire the vehicles for those up to 30 positions as well. We're recommending $80,000 be allocated for the purchase of ballistic helmets for our police personnel. Sadly and unfortunately, we've had 2 of our officers within the last few years suffer some traumatic head injuries as a result of the line of duty responsibilities. This would provide equipment that would hopefully help mitigate that from occurring again within our community and our department. And then finally, the SHOT Spotter program. We're proposing $780,000 be allocated to pilot this program. Very quickly, SHOT Spotter technology is a piece of hardware that is attached to a pole. It picks up the sound of gunfire. It turns to the sound of that gunfire, can help either capture the image of the individual who has fired a weapon or the vehicle that they're traveling in. Communities who have installed this technology have seen a significant decrease in armed criminal activity, as well as a significant increase in prosecution of those offenses. As this would just be a pilot program, this would cover 4 square miles within our city. We'd use data to help drive that to some of the most pressing areas in our city, but would certainly be one we could pilot. And if we see the significant statistical benefits of that, then we as a staff could work to make this a permanent part of our budget. Enhancing public health, we're proposing $300,000 be allocated to help with the startup cost of our newly reinstated Independence Health Department, as well as $85,000 for a grant writer for emergency services grant. I told the Audit and Finance Committee on Friday that I would suggest that that grant writer's first grant be one to make their job permanent, and then go from there. But I think this would dovetail well with both our health department as well as our public safety departments as well. Attracting and retaining quality employers, we would recommend $750,000 be allocated for a public transit subsidy. As we discussed in the course of our budget presentation and deliberations last year, our public transit system is highly subsidized by our general fund. Unfortunately, the revenues, both from fares and from grant dollars, don't fully cover the expenditure of providing that service. So we would recommend that these dollars be utilized to help subsidize that cost for each of the next 3 years as we continue to refine that and hopefully close the gap on that subsidy. We also propose a job training program be funded for $310,000. Very quickly, you may recall a few years ago, the council allocated $75,000 from the Federal Community Development Block Grant Fund to help job train certified nurse assistants as well as welders. We got great data about the economic benefit that that provided to those individuals, the increased household income that they saw as a result. You also last month heard a presentation from the Truman Heartland Community Foundation and Community Services League on their workforce training program. Those are the kind of activities we're talking about supporting with these dollars. Improving our long-range financial planning and decision-making, we are recommending $1.8 million be allocated to help immediately infuse the cash balance within our Stay Well Fund. This would bring us to what we call 2.5 times incurred but not reported, or IBNR, expenses for that fund, which would put it on better financial footing. But then we're also recommending $4.4 million over a 3-year period be infused into the fund as well to help subsidize the cost of that. I don't think that that's going to fully eliminate the need for a premium increase over that period of time, but it will certainly help significantly defray the need as we continue to work with our Stay Well Committee on bringing financial stability to our Stay Well Fund. We also recommend paying off the general loan fund to the electric fund of $56,000. This was the loan that was made a few years ago to purchase the 10 electric vehicles out of the Power and Light Fund, and the general fund's been slowly paying off. This would also wipe that debt off the books. Under communicate more effectively, I know this has been a big topic of communication from the council as well, so we do recommend $333,000 be earmarked for a phone system upgrade. If you've tried to call City Hall, that can be a very challenging customer service experience at times, so this would bring more reliability and stability to that system. Another key aspect of that would be if you, for example, were calling the utility center, if there was a wait, you could record your number. It would call you back at your place in line instead of having to stay on hold for a period of time. So we think this would bring better customer service all around for our citizens here in Independence. City Hall security and citizen interaction improvements. During the course of the pandemic, we've just noticed both opportunities to better the customer service experience coming to City Hall, as well as the safety of some of our employees who work here. So we're recommending $100,000 be allocated to help fund some of those facility improvements. And then replacing the content management system for $125,000. That would allow us to make some significant improvements to our city website, improve the customer experience for those who choose to engage with us on that medium, and make that more customer friendly. Finally, in the realm of revenue replacement, we're recommending $3.1 million be allocated to help deal with revenue losses in the general fund, and $150,000 in the tourism fund. Those were the two hardest hit areas that we saw in the pandemic. But for these dollars, we'd probably face, well, not probably, we would be facing some significant and dire budget cuts in both of those funds. This helps mitigate that and makes our budget picture far less draconian. So, Madam Mayor, let me very quickly share with you that at the Audit and Finance Committee last Friday, that committee, of course, is chaired by Councilmember DeLucy and also includes Councilmember Perkins and Hobart. We were asked as staff what's the cost of adding 1 hour of bus service. Right now, all of our routes end at 5 o'clock. We were asked what would it cost to extend that to 6 p.m. That cost is $90,000. So if the council was to do that, we would need to reallocate $90,000 from another use. The committee did discuss the merits of the Abandoned Vehicle Enforcement Program, and they wondered if the VIPs, the volunteers, and police services could help do some of that parking enforcement activity. In speaking with Chief Halsey, they can. The challenge we have faced recently is that some of those volunteers are getting longer in years, and that's not really an activity that suits their abilities right now. So this is yet another challenge for us to find that next generation of volunteers in police services. But that is an option for us to use those fine individuals in that capacity. There was some discussion about restoring the neighborhood dumpster program from prior years. We shared with the committee that that was about $100,000 per event. That was the event where a dumpster would be placed, usually one per year per council district. Citizens could come and throw just about anything away in there that wouldn't be normally picked up by the trash. So we discussed that. And then finally, there was a lot of discussion about reallocating funds to further enhance the police recruitment fund. Staff was asked to visit with police leadership about the need for that recruitment versus some of the other uses like the abandoned vehicle program. Chief Halsey this evening is in Jefferson City testifying on some legislation, so we haven't had those discussions in full yet, but we'll follow up for the committee. So tonight, Madam Mayor and members of the council, we just wanted to get this under your nose. Our intent is to bring this to you at a upcoming city council meeting, so this isn't the last time you'll see this. If there is any specific feedback, we'd be happy to record that tonight, but the biggest priority this evening was to make sure the council saw this and started to think and ponder about it. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there comments and questions from the council? I have a couple. This is very good. I know this represents a tremendous amount of work and looking at our needs. I would add we have potentially other sources to help assist with some of our needs, including potentially some additional CARES Act money through the KCATA, and certainly some money from the state, which the governor has asked for input into. Committee has been assigned. Our local representative, Representative Ingrid Burnett, is serving on that committee. They met for the first time today at 11 o'clock. It's obviously very preliminary, but we will have some opportunity to give suggestions onto how that state money may be spent to help aid in this. And I understand, like all budgets, this is a plan. This will come forward to the council for allocation of the exact dollar amounts into these different things, but I think it's a very good outline. My really one question is about the job training program. $310,000 proposed for job training. As you referenced, Mr. City Manager, we have traditionally used CDBG funding to do various forms of job training. What, if you know, and maybe you don't, what will be the amount of money that we will have available through CDBG that we could potentially apply towards job training?
As you say, Mayor, our amount, is a formula that adjusts every year, but traditionally that comes in at around $785,000. The city, by council ordinance decades ago, sets aside, I believe it's 15 or 20% to go for local community needs, so think food pantries and domestic violence shelters and of the like. A portion of that's then set aside for the staff administration costs, but typically we are able to allocate in the neighborhood of $450,000 to $500,000 across a multitude of use. So it's a competing resource like everything, but that's the amount that's available for discussion and allocation.
Okay, I mean, I'm just looking at this money and saying, let's use this money for things that we cannot fund any other way. I mean, this is very flexible. These are very flexible dollars. And following the presentation that we received a few weeks ago from the Truman Heartland Community Foundation and many partners who are involved with that program, I reached back out to Community Services League to say, these are the number of people who we help to fund to go through these various programs, as others did as well. It wasn't completely funded by us. I really think it would be helpful for us to know how many of those people are still employed in those careers. Getting them trained and hired is an important step, but sustainable employment is another important data point that I think would be helpful for us to know. Our goal is not only to have people in our community trained for a career, but for them to succeed in that career and have upward mobility in that career or another career of their choice. So that would be important information. As I said during that presentation, our greatest need is for police officers, and their program currently does not include law enforcement. And maybe it never will. But I'm very pleased to see what we're doing to continue to make that a focus in this budget, and certainly by the voter-approved Prop P, which the money is sitting there wanting to be spent.
Correct.
So I'm going to look at that job training a little bit closely and understand what how that's going to dovetail with our other opportunities for funding, what the community is doing through these other programmings, and what kind of jobs we're training people for. While the Community Foundation program's great, they're focused on 6 industries or career paths, and it would be beneficial for us to know what are our major employers in this city lacking. We still have a very small percentage of our working population who is being employed inside of the city of Independence, and I think we need to understand that much more about where we're going to apply these funds. We have incredible partners in this city through Community Services League, through our library system, and these agencies that are assisting with that, but that cannot be the only entry point to job training when we have so many people in our community who are having to be retrained because of COVID-19 losing their job, and making sure that we're fitting those needs as well. So that's the one thing that really stood out to me. I know we'll get an opportunity to look at this much more closely. And I did want to say, you know, I was pleased to hear, as I'm sure the council was, from our newly formed Independence Police Foundation and their recommendations towards this, and perhaps there would be some opportunity also to support their fundraising efforts to help address some of this through some private dollars, such as the abandoned vehicle program. And we just need to also continually to encourage more volunteers in our city to assist us with these important programs like the VIPs.
Certainly.
That's all I had. Is there anything else? Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. City Manager. Next, Madam City Clerk, is our board and commissions report.
Thank you. First is the Stormwater Control Oversight Committee. Recommendation has been made by Mayor Weir to appoint Tim Devaney. If there's no objection from the council, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, we'll add that to the next agenda.
Next is Board of Equalization. Recommendation's been made to appoint Karen Mell. If there's no objection, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, please add that to the next agenda.
Next is Japanese Sister City Committee. Recommendation's been made to reappoint Rosemary Trimble and appoint Katie Gall and Rhiannon Watkins. If there's no objection, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Is there any objection? Hearing none, we'll add that to the next agenda.
Next is the City Judicial Commission. Recommendation's been made by Zach Walker to appoint Michael Rose. If there's no objection, we'll add a resolution to the next agenda.
Is there any objection? Okay, hearing none, we will add that to the next meeting.
Okay.
That concludes our agenda for this evening. I did want to take a moment to talk about our updated health order, because that announcement was made today. As the council knows, beginning in February, we issued our own local health order for the City of Independence, and that is reviewed every 30 days. It was reviewed mid-last week, and in consultation with the acting health director, the city manager, myself, and members of our Independence Health Department, the determination has been made that beginning on April the 23rd, the bars and restaurants will be allowed to open at 100% of their seated capacity with no social distancing required. They will continue to be required to wear masks while not actively eating or drinking, and we certainly encourage everybody to continue to practice good hygiene with hand washing and maintaining a comfortable distance from people who are not in their immediate family or in their party. But our commercial businesses will be allowed to open at 100% capacity starting on April the 23rd. That's the most significant part of this order. We also are at this time continuing to require 6 feet of distance between people at large gatherings, which we identify as gatherings of 300 people or more. This is an ever-changing situation, as we know, rapidly changing for the better now that vaccines are available to all adults starting on April the 9th. We feel that 2 weeks after that time, we will see an increase in the number of vaccinated people in our city and in our region. I would remind you that we still have vaccination clinics going on. There are spots available, and we're starting to see a decline in demand for vaccines. So if you are interested in getting a vaccine and you are eligible for a vaccine, please remember to contact the Independence Health Department and get yourself scheduled, and we have those available. So that is very good news. And we've had a tremendous success with those events, and we're seeing more and more people being fully vaccinated. So we felt that it would be appropriate at this time to make this change. As the order says, we review this a minimum of every 30 days. This will be reviewed again in 15 days because of the great progress that we've made and the sustained low number of new cases, infections, and hospitalizations. So there may be additional changes made yet this month, but we will determine that in the next 15 days. But I wanted to make that available because you'll likely be hearing about that since that was announced today. Mr. City Manager, anything else this evening?
Nothing tonight, Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, we are adjourned.